The violinist's bow trembled before it ever touched the strings, because everyone in the ballroom could feel it, the sharp, humiliating silence of a bride abandoned at her own wedding. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors in a luxury hotel overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago, and yet all that glitter could not hide the sight of Margaret sitting alone in her white gown, her wheelchair angled toward a doorway that would never open. Imagine the weight of that moment pressing against your ribs. Imagine hearing whispers behind manicured hands, seeing guests avoid your eyes, feeling your heartbeat echo in a room built for celebration. If this were you, what would you do? Would you crumble beneath the spectacle, or would you hold your head up and pretend your world was not breaking in half? Margaret had built her life from rubble once before. A decade earlier, a highway accident outside St. Louis had stolen the use of her legs and nearly her will to live. She had been 26, ambitious, newly engaged to a different man back then, with dreams of running marathons and building an empire. The drunk driver survived with minor injuries. Margaret survived without the ability to walk. For months, she lay in a rehabilitation center staring at ceiling tiles, bargaining with a god she barely knew, wondering why breath had been spared but movement taken. Pain reshaped her, but so did defiance. She inherited her father's logistics company after his sudden heart attack and transformed it into a national freight powerhouse. She became one of the youngest female CEOs in the Midwest, her name appearing in Forbes lists, her penthouse apartment rising above the Chicago skyline like a monument to resilience. Wealth followed her discipline, but loneliness followed her wealth. When she met Andrew at a charity gala in Boston, she allowed herself to believe in softness again. He was charming, attentive, careful not to mention the wheelchair as if it were a flaw. He told her she was inspiring, that her strength moved him. He spoke of building a life together, of children, of partnership. Margaret, who negotiated million-dollar contracts without blinking, found herself trembling at the thought of being loved. She paid little attention to how quickly he grew accustomed to her private jet trips and designer gifts, how naturally he slipped into the role of a man living off a woman's empire. She wanted romance more than she wanted suspicion. On the morning of the wedding, she had woken before dawn in her suite at the Waldorf Hotel, watching pink light spill across the city. Her wedding gown was custom designed, fitted perfectly to drape over her seated frame. She had cried when she first saw it, not from vanity, but from relief that beauty still felt possible. Her best friend Vanessa had clasped her hands and whispered that this was her second chance at happiness. Margaret believed it. But when the ceremony time came, Andrew never appeared. There were murmurs at first, then frantic phone calls, then a pale-faced best man who admitted Andrew had checked out of his hotel room at dawn. A text message followed, cold, brief, cowardly. He wrote that he could not go through with it, that the pressure was too much, that he was not ready for a life so public, so complicated. Later, Margaret would discover he had transferred a substantial sum from a joint account the night before and boarded a flight to Europe. In that ballroom, however, none of that mattered. What mattered was the hollow space beside her. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some left quickly, embarrassed to witness heartbreak so naked. Others stared with pity that cut deeper than cruelty. Margaret felt stripped of more than dignity. She felt foolish, powerful CEO, self-made millionaire, and yet she had been blind to a simple truth. Not everyone who praises your strength loves you for it. Some love the shelter it provides. The wedding planner approached gently, asking whether the reception should be canceled. Margaret looked at the towering cake, the orchestra waiting for instruction, the staff frozen in uncertainty. Cancel it? She almost laughed, as if canceling could erase the sting. She nodded mechanically. People began to disperse, and then she noticed him. Near the back of the ballroom stood a man in a modest gray suit, holding the hand of a little girl in a pink dress that looked slightly too big for her. He had not left like the others. His name was Thomas, though Margaret did not know it yet. He had been hired as part of the hotel's maintenance team, called in earlier that morning to fix a lighting issue near the stage. When the ceremony unraveled, he had lingered, unsure whether to slip away unnoticed. His daughter Ruby, whom he had brought because her babysitter canceled, stared wide-eyed at the glittering room. Thomas was a single father from the south side of Chicago, working 2 jobs since his wife passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. His hands were rough, his savings almost non-existent, his days a constant calculation of bills and school lunches. He knew something about being left alone in a room that used to hold laughter. Ruby tugged at his sleeve and whispered something. He hesitated, then slowly guided her forward across the marble floor toward Margaret. Guests watched, confused, as this maintenance worker approached the abandoned bride. Thomas's heart pounded. He was aware of the stairs, of the invisible line between wealth and poverty that he was crossing. He stopped a respectful distance from Margaret's wheelchair. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but gentle. He said he was sorry for what happened. He said no one deserved to feel alone on a day meant for joy. And then, glancing at the orchestra still seated with their instruments poised in uncertainty, he offered something that would change all their lives. He asked her simply if she would like to dance. There was a ripple of awkward laughter from a few corners of the room. Dance? The word hung fragile in the air. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. For a split second, humiliation flared. Was this pity? Was she being mocked? But Thomas's eyes held no mockery, only quiet sincerity. He did not see a billionaire in a wheelchair. He saw a woman whose heart had just been broken in front of a crowd. If you were her, would you risk one more moment of vulnerability? Or would you shut down completely, protect the shards of pride you had left? Margaret surprised herself by nodding. The orchestra, unsure but moved, began a slow, trembling melody. Thomas stepped closer, carefully placing one hand over hers and the other lightly at her shoulder, mindful of her chair. Ruby clapped softly from the side. Thomas did not attempt to spin or lift her. He simply swayed, guiding the wheelchair gently in rhythm, turning the humiliation into something tender. The marble floor reflected their movement like a quiet miracle. At first, Margaret's chest ached with grief. Then, gradually, something else seeped in. A warmth not born of romance, but of humanity. Thomas did not try to impress her. He did not speak of strength or inspiration. He treated her as though dancing together was the most natural thing in the world. Guests who had lingered began to watch not with pity, but with softened expressions. Some wiped tears. For the first time that day, Margaret laughed. It came unexpectedly, a fragile sound that startled even her. The laughter cracked the shell of humiliation that had encased her. She realized that Andrew's absence, while devastating, did not define her worth. A stranger's kindness was reminding her of that. After the music ended, the ballroom felt different, lighter. Margaret asked Thomas to stay for cake. He refused at first, embarrassed by his work badge and worn suit, but she insisted. Ruby beamed as she tasted frosting meant for a celebration that had almost dissolved into disaster. In the weeks that followed, Margaret could not forget that dance. She arranged for Thomas to visit her office under the pretense of thanking him formally. They talked for hours. She learned about his late wife, about nights spent studying bills at the kitchen table, about Ruby's dream of becoming a teacher. Thomas learned about Margaret's accident, about the suffocating loneliness behind her success, about how wealth sometimes builds walls instead of bridges. Their worlds were vastly different, yet grief had carved similar shapes in them both. Margaret found herself drawn not to Thomas's circumstances but to his steadiness. He never asked for money, never hinted at advantage. When she offered to help with Ruby's school tuition, he hesitated until she framed it as an investment in a child's future rather than charity. Slowly, cautiously, friendship deepened. They shared simple dinners instead of galas. Ruby would curl up beside Margaret's wheelchair, chattering about school while Thomas cooked pasta in Margaret's expansive kitchen that once felt echoingly empty. The penthouse began to feel like a home. Margaret faced public scrutiny when tabloids caught wind of the unlikely connection between a wealthy CEO and a maintenance worker. Investors questioned her judgment. Social acquaintances whispered that she was acting out of trauma. But for once, she did not let the noise dictate her heart. She had learned that appearances could deceive, that a polished exterior might conceal cowardice, and a humble suit might conceal extraordinary courage. A year after the abandoned wedding, Margaret hosted another gathering in a far smaller venue by Lake Michigan. There were no crystal chandeliers, no media invitations. Just close friends, Vanessa, a handful of Thomas's co-workers, and Ruby scattering flower petals with fierce concentration. Margaret wore a simple ivory dress. Thomas wore the same gray suit, tailored now to fit him better. This time, when music filled the room, there was no empty doorway. There was no suffocating silence. There was only a man who had once asked a broken bride to dance, and a woman who had dared to say yes. Before the story closes, tell me in the comments what you would have done in that ballroom. Would you have left quietly, or would you have reached out your hand? Margaret often said later that losing Andrew was the most public humiliation of her life, but it was also the doorway to the most private joy she had ever known. Sometimes the worst day becomes the turning point we never see coming. Sometimes the person with the least to offer materially gives the most when it matters. And sometimes when you are left alone in the center of a shattered dream, all it takes is one brave, compassionate question to change everything. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like, share, and subscribe. But only if you believe in the quiet power of kindness, second chances, and the courage to dance when the music feels like it has stopped forever.